She is the soft echo of a dazzling, merciless era, a woman who danced between love, ruin, and redemption. Her voice is cracked, yet within those cracks lies a truth no perfection could ever hold. Once, she was London's golden child, a teenage dream with eyes like morning light, and a song that seemed to promise the world something pure. The 60s crowned her its muse, a living symbol of beauty, freedom, and danger. But the same light that made her shine was the one that burned her down. The tabloids called her fallen, the world moved on, yet Marianne Faithfull refused to disappear. She came back, not as the girl the world remembered, but as the woman the world had forgotten it needed. Her voice, scarred by years of survival, became the sound of truth, raw, broken, and real. This is her story, not of fame, but of endurance, of how a voice once lost to chaos found its way back through the cracks of time and kept singing. London, 1964. The city was alive, a blur of youth, rebellion, and impossible charm. The world was changing fast, and so was its soundtrack. Somewhere between smoky cafes and the glow of Carnaby Street, a 17-year-old girl caught the world's attention. Her name was Marianne Evelyn Gabriel Faithfull, a convent school girl with a voice like porcelain and sadness, and a face that seemed to belong to another time. She wasn't just beautiful, she was captivating, radiating both innocence and a quiet, unreadable melancholy. She wasn't searching for fame, but fame was searching for her. Andrew Loog Oldham, the young producer behind the Rolling Stones, heard her sing one night at a party. Within weeks, she was on stage, draped in innocence and spotlight. Her first single, As Tears Go By, wasn't just a song, it was a prophecy. A song about loss, sung by someone who hadn't yet lived it.
No, I just came up for a party. They said, would you like to come to a party in London? And I said, oh, I've never been to a party in London. Okay. Andrew Oldham. Andrew Oldham was at the party and discovered me. It was very funny.
She became the face of swinging London, photographed in lace dresses, sipping tea beside pop stars and poets, a symbol of beauty, fragility, and modern rebellion. Every camera wanted her. Every magazine called her perfect. And for a moment, she was perfection, a mirror of everything the 60s dreamed it could be. But perfection is never built to last. Behind the smiles and the glamour, something darker began to move, a quiet dissonance between who she was and what the world wanted her to be. The lights of London were dazzling, but they were also blinding. Fame did not simply surround Marianne Faithfull, it absorbed her. By the mid-1960s, she was no longer just a rising singer. She was a fixture of London's most photographed circles, standing beside the men who were rewriting rock history. Her relationship with Mick Jagger changed everything. It wasn't just romance, it was mythology in real time. With him, she stepped deeper into the orbit of the Rolling Stones, a world of brilliance, provocation, and excess. The music grew darker, the nights grew longer, and Marianne was no longer framed as an angelic solo artist, but as the high priestess of a dangerous new freedom. Yet she was not merely a spectator. She co-wrote the lyrics to Sister Morphine, a haunting meditation on pain and dependency. Even then, the themes were there: longing, escape, numbness. Art was starting to mirror reality. In 1967, everything cracked wider. A police raid at the home of Keith Richards in Redlands turned into a media spectacle. Marianne was there, and the press seized the moment. Overnight, she transformed in the public imagination, from fragile muse to symbol of decadence. The headlines were cruel, the moral outrage theatrical, the innocence the media once sold was now something they delighted in dismantling. Behind the myth, her personal life was fracturing too. Her marriage collapsed. Motherhood drifted further away as chaos tightened its grip. The 60s had promised liberation, but liberation without ground can feel like free fall. Addiction did not arrive as a villain. It arrived as relief, as anesthesia, as a way to quiet the noise. By the early 1970s, she disappeared from the charts, but not from suffering. She lived for a time on the streets of Soho, battling heroin dependency, battling illness, battling the slow erosion of her own body. There were attempts to return small recordings, fragments of recovery, but the industry had already rewritten its narrative. The 60s were over. Punk was coming. The world had no patience for yesterday's fallen angels. Her voice changed, not gently, not artistically, but physically. Years of addiction and laryngitis scarred it. The porcelain tone was gone. In its place was something cracked, smoke-stained, and jagged. To many, it sounded ruined, but ruin has a strange property. it reveals structure. By the late 1970s, Marianne Faithfull was no longer the girl London had crowned. She was something harder, stripped of illusion, tempered by survival. The fall did not erase her. It dismantled the myth and left the woman. And in that altered voice, in that broken register the world once mocked, a new sound was waiting. Not innocence, not perfection, truth.
Has it been easy for you to come back into music? You've been 10 years out of it now.
It wasn't easy at first, but it sort of gets easier all the time. It was quite difficult to sort of go into a record company again and sort of say, I want to make a record.
By the late 1970s, Marianne Faithfull was not expected to return. The industry had moved on. The 60s were nostalgia. Her name belonged to old headlines and faded photographs. But survival has its own timing. In 1979, she released Broken English. It did not sound like a comeback. It sounded like confrontation. Gone was the porcelain voice of her youth. In its place was something lower, rougher, almost androgynous. A voice carved by cigarettes, addiction, illness, and endurance. To some it was shocking, to others it was undeniable. Broken English was not interested in reclaiming innocence. It rejected it. The production was tense, modern, restless, closer to post-punk than to the folk pop of her past. Cold synthesizers, nervous rhythms, a sense of urban paranoia running beneath every track. And in the middle of it stood Marianne, not as a muse, not as a fallen angel, but as an author of her own survival. The songs were sharp, political, sexual, unapologetic. She no longer sang like someone asking to be loved. She sang like someone who had nothing left to prove. Critics who once dismissed her listened again. And this time, they heard depth, they heard experience. They heard a woman who had lived through the mythology that once consumed her. The album was nominated for a Grammy, but more importantly, it redefined her. The cracks in her voice were no longer flaws, they were testimony. What once sounded ruined now sounded honest. And in that honesty, she found something the 60s never gave her: control. Marianne Faithfull did not return to who she was. She became someone new, older, wiser, unbreakable in a different way. The dazzling girl was gone, the broken woman remained, and somehow she was stronger.
I really wanted to live. I wanted to do things that I wanted to do and not be responsible to the public or to anybody. I felt I'd been living in a goldfish bowl, and I'd had enough.
After Broken English, Marianne Faithfull did not chase trends, she outlived them. The 1980s came and went, pop changed its face, rock reinvented itself again and again. But Marianne moved differently now, not as someone trying to belong, but as someone who already knew who she was. Her later records carried a quiet authority. Albums like Strange Weather in 1987 felt less like statements and more like meditations. She sang standards and torch songs as if she had personally lived every word. And in a way she had. You could hear it in the phrasing, the slight delay before a line, the gravity behind a whisper. Her voice had aged further, but it had also deepened into something almost literary. You did not listen to Marianne Faithfull anymore for perfection. You listened for truth. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new generation began to understand her differently. Not as a relic of swinging London, not as Mick Jagger's former lover, but as a survivor who had transformed damage into art. Younger musicians sought her out. They recognized something in her, a refusal to sanitize experience, a refusal to perform youth. Time, which once seemed determined to erase her, had done something unexpected. It had clarified her. Illness would return in later years, battles with cancer, complications, setbacks that might have silenced someone else. But by then, silence was no longer her enemy. She had already proven that a voice can change and still matter. Marianne Faithfull's story was never really about fame. It was about endurance, about surviving an era that consumed its icons, about stepping out of mythology and into authorship. The dazzling girl of 1964 became the broken woman of the 1970s. The broken woman became the uncompromising artist of 1979. And in the long after, in the years beyond scandal, beyond headlines, she became something even rarer. A witness. A woman who had seen the machinery of fame from the inside and lived to sing about it. Her voice, once called fragile, once called ruined, became one of the most unmistakable instruments of her generation, not because it was flawless, but because it was human. And in the end, that was always her greatest strength. Time continued its quiet work. Through the 2000s and 2010s, Marianne Faithfull kept recording, kept performing, even as her body demanded more from her than it once did. Illness returned more than once. Cancer, fragile lungs, periods of exhaustion that would have convinced many to step away. She did not. Her later albums felt less like career moves and more like documents, reflections from someone who had nothing left to hide. When she sang, it was no longer about reinvention, it was about testimony. The voice had grown thinner with age, but its authority remained. Every breath carried decades. Every pause felt deliberate. She no longer needed to project power. She embodied it quietly. In her final years, the world had changed again. The 60s were long mythologized. The scandals had softened into stories. The cruelty of the tabloids felt distant. What remained was the work. When Marianne Faithfull passed away in 2025, tributes did not describe her as a muse. They did not define her by romance or scandal. They called her an artist. They spoke of resilience, of fearlessness, of a voice that refused to disappear even when the world tried to silence it. That was the real transformation. The dazzling girl of London did not survive. The myth did not survive, but the woman did. And in the end, that is her legacy. Not perfection, not tragedy, endurance. Her voice, cracked, weathered, unmistakable, continues to echo through the music she left behind. A reminder that art does not come from flawlessness. It comes from living, and Marianne Faithfull lived.